Listen and relax. Crafting serenity, one audiobook at a time.
Did Angela take kindly to the idea of boarding school? No, she didn't. She was furious with Amias. Caroline took her side, but Amias had absolutely made up his mind about it. In spite of a hot temper, Amias was an easy man in most respects. But when he really got his back up, everyone had to give in. Both Caroline and Angela knuckled under. She was to go to school when? At the autumn term. They were getting her kit together, I remember. I suppose if it hadn't been for the tragedy, she would have gone off a few days later. There was some talk of her packing on the morning of that day. Poirot said, "And the governess?" "What do you mean, the governess?" "How did she like the idea? It deprived her of a job, did it not?" "Yes, well, I suppose it did in a way. Little Carla used to do a few lessons, but of course she was only, 6 or thereabouts. She had a nurse. They wouldn't have kept Miss Williams on for her." "Yes, that's the name, Williams." "Funny how things come back to you when you talk them over." "Yes, indeed. You are back now, are you not, in the past? You relive the scenes. The words that people said, their gestures, the expressions on their faces." Meredith Blake said slowly, "In a way, yes, but there are gaps, you know. Great chunks missed out. I remember, for instance, the shock it was to me when I first learned that Amias was going to leave Caroline. But I can't remember whether it was he who told me or Elsa. I do remember arguing with Elsa on the subject, trying to show her, that it was a pretty rotten thing to do, and she only laughed at me in that cool way of hers and said I was old-fashioned. Well, I dare say I am old-fashioned, but I still think I was right. Amias had a wife and a child. He ought to have stuck to them." "But Miss Greer thought that point of view out of date." "Yes. Mind you, 16 years ago, divorce wasn't looked on quite so much as a matter of course as it is now. But Elsa was the kind of girl who went in for being modern. Her point of view was that when two people weren't happy together, it was better to make a break. She said that Amias and Caroline never stopped having rows, and that it was far better for the child that she shouldn't be brought up in an atmosphere of disharmony." "And her argument did not impress you?" Meredith Blake said slowly. "I felt all the time that she didn't really know what she was talking about. She was rattling these things off, things she'd read in books or heard from her friends. It was like a parrot. She was, it's a queer thing to say, pathetic somehow. So young and so self-confident." He paused. "There is something about youth, Monsieur Poirot, that can be terribly moving." Hercule Poirot said, looking at him with some interest, "I know what you mean." Blake went on, speaking more to himself than to Poirot. "That's partly, I think, why I tackled Crail. He was nearly 20 years older than the girl. It didn't seem fair." Poirot murmured, "Alas, how seldom one makes any effect. When a person has determined on a certain course, it is not easy to turn them from it." Meredith Blake said, "That is true enough." His tone was a shade bitter. "I certainly did no good by my interference. But then, I am not a very convincing person. I never have been." Poirot threw him a quick glance. He read into that slight acerbity of tone the dissatisfaction of a sensitive man with his own lack of personality, and he acknowledged to himself the truth of what Blake had just said. Meredith Blake was not the man to persuade anyone into or out of any course. His well-meaning attempts would always be set aside, indulgently, usually, without anger, but definitely set aside. They would not carry weight. He was essentially an ineffective man. Poirot said, with an appearance of changing a painful subject, "You still have your laboratory of medicines and cordials, yes?" "No." The word came sharply, with an almost anguished rapidity. Meredith Blake said, his face flushing, "I abandoned the whole thing, dismantled it. I couldn't go on with it. How could I, after what had happened? The whole thing, you see, might have been said to be my fault." "No, Monsieur Blake, you are too sensitive. But don't you see? If I hadn't collected those damned drugs, if I hadn't laid stress on them, boasted about them, forced them on those people's notice that afternoon, but I never thought. I never dreamed. How could I? How indeed? But I went on bumbling on about them. Pleased with my little bit of knowledge, blind, conceited fool, I pointed out the damned Conan. I even, fool that I was, took them back into the library and read about that passage from the Phaedo describing Socrates' death. A beautiful piece of writing. I've always admired it, but it's haunted me ever since. Poirot said, "Did they find any fingerprints on the quinine bottle?" "Hers." "Caroline Crale's?" "Yes." "Not yours?" "No, I didn't handle the bottle, you see. Only pointed to it." "But at the same time, surely you handled it?" "Oh, of course, but I gave the bottles a periodic dusting from time to time. I never allowed the servants in there, of course. And I had done that about 4 or 5 days previously." "You kept the room locked up?" "Invariably." "When did Caroline Crale take the quinine from the bottle?" Meredith Blake replied reluctantly. "She was the last to leave the room. I called her, I remember, and she came hurrying out. Her cheeks were just a little pink, and her eyes wide and excited. Oh, God, I can see her now." Poirot said, "Did you have any conversation with her at all that afternoon? I mean by that, did you discuss the situation as between her and her husband at all?" Blake said slowly, in a low voice, "Not directly. She was looking, as I've told you, very upset. I said to her at a moment when we were more or less by ourselves, 'Is anything the matter, my dear?' She said, 'Everything's the matter.' I wish you could have heard the desperation in her voice. Those words were the absolute, literal truth. There is no getting away from it. Amias Crale was Caroline's whole world. She said, 'Everything's gone. Finished. I'm finished, Meredith.' And then she laughed, and turned to the others and was suddenly, wildly and very unnaturally gay." Hercule Poirot nodded his head slowly. He looked very like a China mandarin. He said, "Yes, I see. It was like that." Meredith Blake pounded suddenly with his fist. His voice rose. It was almost a shout. "And I'll tell you this, Monsieur Poirot. When Caroline Crale said at the trial that she took the stuff for herself, I'll swear she was speaking the truth. There was no thought in her mind of murder at that time. I swear there wasn't. That came later." Hercule Poirot asked, "Are you sure that it did come later?" Blake stared. He said, "I beg your pardon? I don't quite understand." Poirot said, "I ask you whether you are sure that the thought of murder ever did come. Are you perfectly convinced in your own mind that Caroline Crale did deliberately commit murder?" Meredith Blake's breath came unevenly. He said, "But if not, are you suggesting an accident of some kind?" "Not necessarily." "Well, that's a very extraordinary thing to say." "Is it? You have called Caroline Crale a gentle creature. Do gentle creatures commit murder?" "Well, she was a gentle creature, but all the same, well, there were very violent quarrels, you know." "Not such a gentle creature, then." "But she was. Oh, how difficult these things are to explain. I am trying to understand. Caroline had a quick tongue, a vehement way of speaking. She might say, 'I hate you,' or 'I wish you were dead,' but it wouldn't entail action. So, in your opinion, it was highly uncharacteristic of Mrs. Crale to commit murder." "You have the most extraordinary way of putting things, Monsieur Poirot. I can only say that, yes, it does seem to me uncharacteristic of her. I can only explain it by realizing that the provocation was extreme. She adored her husband. Under those circumstances, a woman might, well, kill." Poirot nodded. "Yes, I agree. I was dumbfounded at first. I didn't feel it could be true. And it wasn't true. If you know what I mean, it wasn't the real Caroline who did that." "But you are quite sure that, in the legal sense, Caroline Crale did do it?" Again, Meredith Blake stared at him. "My dear man, if she didn't..." "Well, if she didn't? I can't imagine any alternative solution." Accident? Surely impossible. Quite impossible, I should say. And I can't believe in the suicide theory. It had to be brought forward, but it was quite unconvincing to anyone who knew Crail. Quite. So what remains? Asked Meredith Blake. Poirot said coolly, There remains the possibility of Amias Crail having been killed by someone else. But that's absurd. You think so? Well, I'm sure of it. Who would have wanted to kill him? Who could have killed him? You are more likely to know than I am. But you don't seriously believe? Perhaps not. It interests me to examine the possibility. Give it your serious consideration. Tell me what you think. Meredith stared at him for a minute or two. Then he lowered his eyes. After a minute or two he shook his head. He said, I can't imagine any possible alternative. I should like to do so. If there were any reason for suspecting anybody else, I would readily believe Caroline innocent. I don't want to think she did it. I couldn't believe it at first. But who else is there? Who else was there? Philip? Crail's best friend? Elsa? Ridiculous. Myself? Do I look like a murderer? A respectable governess? A couple of old faithful servants? Perhaps you'd suggest that the child Angela did it. No, Monsieur Poirot. There's no alternative. Nobody could have killed Amias Crail but his wife. But he drove her to it. And so, in a way, it was suicide after all, I suppose. Meaning that he died by the result of his own actions, though not by his own hand. Yes, it's a fanciful point of view, perhaps, but, well, cause and effect, you know. Hercule Poirot said, Have you ever reflected, Monsieur Blake, that the reason for murder is nearly always to be found by a study of the person murdered? I hadn't exactly. Yes, I suppose I see what you mean. Poirot said, Until you know exactly what sort of a person the victim was, you cannot begin to see the circumstances of a crime clearly. He added, That is what I am seeking for, and what you and your brother have helped to give me. A reconstruction of the man Amias Crail. Meredith Blake passed the main point of the remark over. His attention had been attracted by a single word. He said quickly, Philip? Yes. You have talked with him also? Certainly. Meredith Blake said sharply, You should have come to me first. Smiling a little, Poirot made a courteous gesture. According to the laws of primogenitude, that is so, he said. I am aware that you are the elder, but you comprehend that as your brother lives near London, it was easier to visit him first. Meredith Blake was still frowning. He pulled uneasily at his lip. He repeated, You should have come to me first. This time Poirot did not answer. He waited. And presently Meredith Blake went on. Philip, he said, is prejudiced. Yes? As a matter of fact, he's a mass of prejudices. Always has been. He shot a quick, uneasy glance at Poirot. He'll have tried to put you against Caroline. Does that matter? So long after? Meredith Blake gave a sharp sigh. I know. I forget that it's so long ago, that it's all over. Caroline is beyond being harmed. But all the same, I shouldn't like you to get a false impression. And you think your brother might give me a false impression? Oh, frankly, I do. You see, there was always a certain, how shall I put it, antagonism between him and Caroline. Why? The question seemed to irritate Blake. He said, Why? How should I know why? These things are so. Philip always crabbed her whenever he could. He was annoyed, I think, when Amias married her. He never went near them for over a year. And yet Amias was almost his best friend. That was the reason, really, I suppose. He didn't feel that any woman was good enough, and he probably felt that Caroline's influence would spoil their friendship. And did it? Well, no, of course it didn't. Amias was always just as fond of Philip, right up to the end. He used to twit him with being a money grabber, and with growing a corporation and being a Philistine generally. Philip didn't care. He just used to grin and say it was a good thing Amias had one respectable friend. How did your brother react to the Elsa Greer affair? Do you know, I find it rather difficult to say. His attitude wasn't really easy to define. He was annoyed, I think, with Amias for making a fool of himself over the girl. He said more than once it wouldn't work, and that Amias would live to regret it. At the same time, I have a feeling, yes, very definitely, I have a feeling that he was just faintly pleased at seeing Caroline let down. Poirot's eyebrows rose. He said, "He really felt like that?" "Oh, don't misunderstand me. I wouldn't go further than to say that I believe that feeling was at the back of his mind. I don't know that he ever quite realized himself that that is what he felt. Philip and I have nothing much in common. But there is a link, you know, between people of the same blood. One brother often knows what the other brother is thinking." "And after the tragedy?" Meredith Blake shook his head. A spasm of pain crossed his face. He said, "Poor Phil. He was terribly cut up. Just broken up by it. He'd always been devoted to Amias, you see. There was an element of hero worship about it, I think. Amias Crail and I are the same age. Philip was 2 years younger, and he looked up to Amias always. Yes, it was a great blow to him. He was terribly bitter against Caroline." "He at least had no doubts, then?" Meredith Blake said, "None of us had any doubts." There was a silence. Then Blake said, with the irritable plaintiveness of a weak man, "It was all over, forgotten, and now you come, raking it all up." "Not I. Caroline Crail." Meredith stared at him. "Caroline? What do you mean?" Poirot said, watching him. "Caroline Crail the second." Meredith's face relaxed. "Ah, yes. The child. Little Carla. I misunderstood you for a moment. You thought I meant the original Caroline Crail. You thought it was she who would not, how shall I say it, rest easy in her grave." Meredith Blake shivered. "Don't, man. You know that she wrote to her daughter, the last words she ever wrote, that she was innocent?" Meredith stared at him. He said, and his voice sounded utterly incredulous, "Caroline wrote that?" "Yes." Poirot paused and said, "It surprises you?" "It would surprise you if you'd seen her in court. Poor, hunted, defenseless creature, not even struggling." "A defeatist?" No, she wasn't that. It was, I think, the knowledge that she'd killed the man she loved. Or I thought it was that." "You are not so sure now?" "To write a thing like that, solemnly, when she was dying." Poirot suggested, "A pious lie, perhaps." "Perhaps," but Meredith was dubious. That's not like Caroline." Hercule Poirot nodded. Carla Le Marchant had said that. Carla had only a child's obstinate memory, but Meredith Blake had known Caroline well. It was the first confirmation Poirot had got that Carla's belief was to be depended upon. Meredith Blake looked up at him. He said slowly, If Caroline was innocent, why, the whole thing's madness. I don't see any other possible solution." He turned sharply on Poirot. "And you? What do you think?" There was a silence. "As yet," said Poirot at last, "I think nothing. I collect only the impressions. What Caroline Crail was like. What Amias Crail was like. What the other people who were there at the time were like. What happened exactly on those 2 days. That is what I need, to go over the facts laboriously one by one. Your brother is going to help me there. He is sending me an account of the events as he remembers them." Meredith Blake said sharply, "You won't get much from that. Philip's a busy man. Things slip his memory once they're past and done with. Probably he'll remember things all wrong. There will be gaps, of course, I realize that." "I tell you what," Meredith paused abruptly, then went on, reddening a little as he spoke. "If you like, I could do the same. I mean, it would be a kind of check, wouldn't it?" Hercule Poirot said warmly, "It would be most valuable. An idea of the first excellence." "Right, I will. I've got some old diaries somewhere. Mind you," he laughed awkwardly, I'm not much of a hand at literary language. Even my spelling's not too good. You won't expect too much. It is not the style I demand, just a plain recital of everything you can remember. What everyone said. How they looked. Just what happened. Never mind if it doesn't seem relevant. It all helps with the atmosphere, so to speak. Yes, I can see that. It must be difficult visualizing people and places you have never seen. Poirot nodded. There is another thing I wanted to ask you. Alderbury is the adjoining property to this, is it not? Would it be possible to go there? To see with my own eyes where the tragedy occurred? Meredith Blake said slowly, I can take you over there right away, but of course it is a good deal changed. It has not been built over. Oh no, thank goodness, not quite as bad as that, but it's a kind of hostel now. It was bought by some society. Hordes of young people come down to it in the summer, and of course all the rooms have been cut up and partitioned into cubicles, and the grounds have been altered a good deal. You must reconstruct it for me by your explanations. I'll do my best. I wish you could have seen it in the old days. It was one of the loveliest properties I know. He led the way out through the window and began walking down a slope of lawn. Who was responsible for selling it? The executors on behalf of the child. Everything Crail had came to her. He hadn't made a will, so I imagine that it would be divided automatically between his wife and the child. Caroline's will left what she had to the child also. Nothing to her half-sister? Angela had a certain amount of money of her own left her by her father. Poirot nodded. I see. Then he uttered an exclamation. But where is it that you take me? This is the seashore ahead of us. I must explain our geography to you. You'll see for yourself in a minute. There's a creek, you see. Camel Creek, they call it. Runs inland. Looks almost like a river mouth, but it isn't. It's just the sea. To get to Alderbury by land, you have to go right inland and round the creek. But the shortest way from one house to the other is to row across this narrow bit of the creek. Alderbury is just opposite. There, you can see the house through the trees. They had come out on a little beach. Opposite them was a wooded headland, and a white house could just be distinguished high up among the trees. 2 boats were drawn up on the beach. Meredith Blake, with Poirot's somewhat awkward assistance, dragged one of them down to the water, and presently they were rowing across to the other side. We always went this way in the old days, Meredith explained. Unless, of course, there was a storm or it was raining, and then we'd take the car. But it's nearly 3 miles if you go round that way. He ran the boat neatly alongside a stone quay on the other side. He cast a disparaging eye on a collection of wooden huts and some concrete terraces. All new, this. Used to be a boathouse, tumbled-down old place, and nothing else. And one walked along the shore and bathed off those rocks over there. He assisted his guest to alight, made fast the boat, and led the way up a steep path. Don't suppose we'll meet anyone, he said over his shoulder. Nobody here in April, except for Easter. Doesn't matter if we do. I'm on good terms with my neighbours. Sun's glorious today. Might be summer. It was a wonderful day then. More like July than September. Brilliant sun, but a chilly little wind. The path came out of the trees and skirted an outcrop of rock. Meredith pointed up with his hand. That's what they call the battery. We're more or less underneath it now, skirting round it. They plunged into trees again, and then the path took another sharp turn, and they emerged by a door set in a high wall. The path itself continued to zigzag upwards, but Meredith opened the door and the 2 men passed through it. For a moment, Poirot was dazzled coming in from the shade outside. The battery was an artificially cleared plateau, with battlements set with cannon. It gave one the impression of overhanging the sea. There were trees above it and behind it, but on the seaside there was nothing but the dazzling blue water below. "Attractive spot," said Meredith. He nodded contemptuously towards a kind of pavilion set back against the back wall. "That wasn't there, of course. Only an old tumble-down shed where Amias kept his painting muck and some bottled beer and a few deck chairs. It wasn't concreted then either. There used to be a bench and a table, painted iron ones, that was all. Still, it hasn't changed much." His voice held an unsteady note. Poirot said, "And it was here that it happened?" Meredith nodded. "The bench was there, up against the shed. He was sprawled on that. He used to sprawl there sometimes when he was painting, just fling himself down and stare, and then suddenly he'd jump up and start laying the paint on the canvas like mad." He paused. "That's why, he looked almost natural, as though he might be asleep, just have dropped off. But his eyes were open, and he'd just stiffened up. Stuff sort of paralyzes you, There isn't any pain. I've always been glad of that." Poirot asked a thing he already knew. "Who found him?" "She did. Caroline. After lunch. I and Elsa, I suppose, were the last ones to see him alive. It must have been coming on then. He looked queer. I'd rather not talk about it. I'll write it to you. Easier that way." He turned abruptly and went out of the battery. Poirot followed him without speaking. The two men went on up the zigzag path. At a higher level than the battery there was another small plateau. It was overshadowed with trees, and there was a bench there and a table. Meredith said, "They haven't changed this much, but the bench used not to be ye old rustic. It was just a painted iron business, a bit hard for sitting, but a lovely view." Poirot agreed. Through a framework of trees one looked down over the battery to the creek mouth. "I sat up here part of the morning," Meredith explained. "Trees weren't quite so overgrown then. One could see the battlements of the battery quite plainly. That's where Elsa was posing, sitting on one with her head twisted round." He gave a slight twitch of his shoulders. "Trees grow faster than one thinks," he muttered. "Oh well, suppose I'm getting old. Come on up to the house." They continued to follow the path till it emerged near the house. It had been a fine old house, Georgian in style. It had been added to, and on a green lawn near it were set some 50 little wooden bathing hutches. "Young men sleep there, girls in the house," Meredith explained. "I don't suppose there's anything you want to see here. All the rooms have been cut about. Used to be a little conservatory tacked on here. These people have built a loggia. Oh well. I suppose they enjoy their holidays. Can't keep everything as it used to be. More's the pity." He turned away abruptly. "We'll go down another way. It all comes back to me, Ghosts. Ghosts everywhere." They returned to the quay by a somewhat longer and more rambling route. Neither of them spoke. Poirot respected his companion's mood. When they reached Handcross Manor once more, Meredith Blake said abruptly, "I bought that picture, the one that Amias was painting. I just couldn't stand the idea of its being sold for, publicity value. A lot of dirty-minded brutes gaping at it. It was a fine piece of work. Amias said it was the best thing he'd ever done. I shouldn't be surprised if he was right. It was practically finished. He only wanted to work on it another day or so. Would you care to see it?" Hercule Poirot said quickly, "Yes, indeed." Blake led the way across the hall and took a key from his pocket. He unlocked a door, and they went into a fair-sized, dusty-smelling room. It was closely shuttered. Blake went across to the windows and opened the wooden shutters. Then, with a little difficulty, he flung up a window, and a breath of fragrant spring air came wafting into the room. Meredith said, "Oh, that's better." He stood by the window inhaling the air, and Poirot joined him. There was no need to ask what the room had been. The shelves were empty, but there were marks upon them where bottles had stood. Against one wall was some derelict chemical apparatus and a sink. The room was thick in dust. Meredith Blake was looking out of the window. He said, "How easily it all comes back. Standing here, smelling the jasmine and talking, like the damn fool I was about my precious potions and distillations." Absently, Poirot stretched a hand through the window. He pulled off a spray of jasmine leaves just breaking from their woody stem. Meredith Blake moved resolutely across the floor. On the wall was a picture covered with a dust sheet. He jerked the dust sheet away. Poirot caught his breath. He had seen so far 4 pictures of Amias Creel's, 2 at the Tate, 1 at a London dealer's, 1 the still life of roses, but now he was looking at what the artist himself had called his best picture, and Poirot realized at once what a superb artist the man had been. The painting had an old, superficial smoothness. At first sight it might have been a poster, so seemingly crude were its contrasts. A girl in a canary yellow shirt and dark blue slacks, sitting on a grey wall in full sunlight against a background of violent blue sea. Just the kind of subject for a poster. But the first appearance was deceptive. There was a subtle distortion, an amazing brilliance and clarity in the light. And the girl. Yes, here was life. All there was, all there could be of life, of youth, of sheer blazing vitality. The face was alive, and the eyes. So much life, such passionate youth. That, then, was what Amias Creel had seen in Elsa Greer, which had made him blind and deaf to the gentle creature, his wife. Elsa was life. Elsa was youth. A superb, slim, straight creature, arrogant, her head turned, her eyes insolent with triumph, looking at you, watching you, waiting. Hercule Poirot spread out his hands. He said, "It is great. Yes, it is great." Meredith Blake said, a catch in his voice, "She was so young." Poirot nodded. He thought to himself, what do most people mean when they say that? So young. Something innocent, something appealing, something helpless. But youth is not that. Youth is crude. Youth is strong. Youth is powerful, yes, and cruel. And one more thing. Youth is vulnerable. He followed his host to the door. His interest was quickened now in Elsa Greer, whom he was to visit next. What would the years have done to that passionate, triumphant, crude child? He looked back at the picture. Those eyes, watching him, telling him something. Suppose he couldn't understand what they were telling him. Would the real woman be able to tell him? Or were those eyes saying something that the real woman did not know? Such arrogance, such triumphant anticipation. And then death had stepped in and taken the prey out of those eager, clutching young hands, and the light had gone out of those passionately anticipating eyes. What were the eyes of Elsa Greer like now? He went out of the room with one last look. He thought, she was too much alive. He felt a little frightened. This little pig had roast beef. The house in Brook Street had Darwin tulips in the window boxes. Inside the hall, a great vase of white lilac sent eddies of perfume towards the open front door. A middle-aged butler relieved Poirot of his hat and stick. A footman appeared to take them, and the butler murmured deferentially, "Will you come this way, sir?" Poirot followed him along the hall and down 3 steps. A door was opened. The butler pronounced his name with every syllable correct. Then the door closed behind him, and a tall, thin man got up from a chair by the fire and came towards him. Lord Dittisham was a man just under 40. He was not only a peer of the realm, he was a poet. 2 of his fantastical poetic dramas had been staged at vast expense and had had a succès d'estime. His forehead was rather prominent, his chin was eager, and his eyes and his mouth unexpectedly beautiful. He said, "Sit down, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot sat down and accepted a cigarette from his host. Lord Dittisham shut the box, struck a match, and held it for Poirot to light his cigarette. Then he himself sat down and looked thoughtfully at his visitor. Then he said, "It is my wife you have come to see, I know." Poirot answered, "Lady Dittisham was so kind as to give me an appointment." "Yes." There was a pause. Poirot hazarded, You do not, I hope, object, Lord Ditisham?" The thin, dreamy face was transformed by a sudden, quick smile. "The objections of husbands, Monsieur Poirot, are never taken seriously in these days." "Then you do object?" "No, I cannot say that, but I am, I must confess, a little fearful of the effect upon my wife. Let me be quite frank. A great many years ago, when my wife was only a young girl, she passed through a terrible ordeal. She has, I hope, recovered from the shock. I have come to believe that she has forgotten it. Now you appear, and necessarily your questions will reawaken those old memories." "It is regrettable," said Hercule Poirot politely. "I do not know quite what the result will be. I can only assure you, Lord Ditisham, that I shall be as discreet as possible, and do all I can not to distress Lady Ditisham. She is no doubt of a delicate and nervous temperament." Then suddenly, and surprisingly, the other laughed. He said, Elsa's as strong as a horse." "Then—" Poirot paused diplomatically. The situation intrigued him. Lord Ditisham said, "My wife is equal to any amount of shocks. I wonder if you know her reason for seeing you?" Poirot replied placidly, "Curiosity?" A kind of respect showed in the other man's eyes. "Ah, you realize that?" Poirot said, "It is inevitable. Women will always see a private detective. Men will tell him to go to the devil. Some women might tell him to go to the devil too. After they have seen him, not before." "Perhaps." Lord Ditisham paused. "What is the idea behind this book?" Hercule Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "One resurrects the old tunes, the old stage turns, the old costumes. One resurrects, too, the old murders." said Lord Ditisham. "If you like, but you will not alter human nature by saying "Pah." Murder is a drama. The desire for drama is very strong in the human race." Lord Ditisham murmured, I know. "So you see," said Poirot, "the book will be written. It is my part to make sure that there shall be no gross misstatements, no tampering with the known facts." "Or the facts are public property, I should have thought." "Yes, but not the interpretation of them." Ditisham said sharply, "Just what do you mean by that, Monsieur Poirot?" "My dear Lord Ditisham, there are many ways of regarding, for instance, a historical fact. Take an example. Many books have been written on your Mary Queen of Scots, representing her as a martyr, as an unprincipled and wanton woman, as a rather simple-minded saint, as a murderess and an intriguer, or again as a victim of circumstance and fate. One can take one's choice. And in this case, Crehl was killed by his wife. That is, of course, undisputed. At the trial, my wife came in for some, in my opinion, undeserved calumny. She had to be smuggled out of court afterwards. Public opinion was very hostile to her." "The English," said Poirot, "are a very moral people." Lord Ditisham said, "Confound them, they are." He added, looking at Poirot, "And you?" "Me?" said Poirot. "I lead a very moral life. That is not quite the same as having moral ideas." Lord Ditisham said, "I've wondered sometimes what this Mrs. Crehl was really like. All this injured wife business. I've a feeling there was something behind that." "Your wife might know," agreed Poirot. "My wife," said Lord Ditisham, "has never mentioned the case once." Poirot looked at him with quickened interest. He said, "Ah, I begin to see." The other said sharply, "What do you see?" Poirot replied with a bow, "The creative imagination of the poet." Lord Ditisham rose and rang the bell. He said brusquely, "My wife will be waiting for you." The door opened. "You rang, my lord?" "Take Monsieur Poirot up to her ladyship." Up 2 flights of stairs, feet sinking into soft pile carpets, subdued floor lighting, money everywhere. Of taste, not so much. There had been a sombre austerity in Lord Ditisham's room, but here in the house there was only a solid lavishness, the best. Not necessarily the showiest or the most startling. Merely expense no object, allied to a lack of imagination. Poirot said to himself, "Roast beef, yes, roast beef." It was not a large room into which he was shown. The big drawing room was on the first floor. This was the personal sitting room of the mistress of the house, and the mistress of the house was standing against the mantelpiece as Poirot was announced and shown in. A phrase leapt into his startled mind and refused to be driven out. She died young. That was his thought as he looked at Elsa Dittisham, who had been Elsa Greer. He would never have recognized her from the picture Meredith Blake had shown him. That had been, above all, a picture of youth, a picture of vitality. Here there was no youth. There might never have been youth. And yet he realized, as he had not realized from Creel's picture, that Elsa was beautiful. Yes, it was a very beautiful woman who came forward to meet him, and certainly not old. After all, what was she? Not more than 36 now, if she had been 20 at the time of the tragedy? Her black hair was perfectly arranged around her shapely head. Her features were almost classic. Her makeup was exquisite. He felt a strange pang. It was perhaps the fault of old Mr. Jonathan speaking of Juliet. No Juliet here, unless perhaps one could imagine Juliet a survivor, living on, deprived of Romeo. Was it not an essential part of Juliet's makeup that she should die young? Elsa Greer had been left alive. She was greeting him in a level, rather monotonous voice. "I'm so interested, Monsieur Poirot. Sit down and tell me what you want me to do." He thought, but she is not interested. Nothing interests her. Big, grey eyes, like dead lakes. Poirot became, as was his way, a little obviously foreign. He exclaimed, "I am confused, madame. Veritably, I am confused." "Oh, no. Why?" "Because I realize that this reconstruction of a past drama must be excessively painful to you." She looked amused. Yes, it was amusement. Quite genuine amusement. She said, "I suppose my husband put that idea into your head. He saw you when you arrived. Of course, he doesn't understand in the least. He never has. I'm not at all the sensitive sort of person he imagines I am." The amusement was still in her voice. She said, "My father, you know, was a mill hand. He worked his way up and made a fortune. You don't do that if you're thin-skinned. I'm the same." Poirot thought to himself, yes, that is true. A thin-skinned person would not have come to stay in Caroline Creel's house. Lady Dittisham said, "What is it you want me to do? You are sure, madame, that to go over the past would not be painful to you?" She considered a minute, and it struck Poirot suddenly that Lady Dittisham was a very frank woman. She might lie from necessity, but never from choice. Elsa Dittisham said slowly, "No, not painful. In a way, I wish it were." "Why?" She said impatiently, "Oh, it's so stupid never to feel anything." And Hercule Poirot thought, yes, Elsa Greer is dead. Aloud he said, "At all events, Lady Dittisham, it makes my task very much easier." She said cheerfully, "What do you want to know?" "Have you a good memory, madame?" "Reasonably good, I think." "And you are sure it will not pain you to go over those days in detail?" "It won't pain me at all. Things can only pain you when they are happening." "It is so with some people, I know." Lady Dittisham said, "That's what Edward, my husband, can't understand. He thinks the trial and all that was a terrible ordeal for me." "Was it not?" Elsa Dittisham said, "No, I enjoyed it." There was a reflective, satisfied quality in her voice. She went on, "God, how that old brute de Pleach went for me. He's a devil, if you like. I enjoyed fighting him. He didn't get me down." She looked at Poirot with a smile. "I hope I'm not upsetting your illusions. A girl of 20? I ought to have been prostrated, I suppose. Agonized with shame or something. I wasn't. I didn't care what they said to me. I only wanted one thing." "What?" "To get her hanged, of course," said Elsa Dittisham. He noticed her hands, beautiful hands, but with long, curving nails. Predatory hands. She said, "You're thinking me vindictive. So I am vindictive, to anyone who has injured me. That woman was to my mind the lowest kind of woman there is. She knew that Amias cared for me, that he was going to leave her, and she killed him so that I shouldn't have him." She looked across at Poirot. "Don't you think that's pretty mean?" "You do not understand or sympathize with jealousy?" "No, I don't think I do. If you've lost, you've lost. If you can't keep your husband, let him go with good grace. It's possessiveness I don't understand." "You might have understood it if you had ever married him." "Well, I don't think so. We weren't—" She smiled suddenly at Poirot. Her smile was, he felt, a little frightening. It was so far removed from any real feeling. "I'd like you to get this right," she said. "Don't think that Amias Creole seduced an innocent young girl. It wasn't like that at all. Of the two of us, I was responsible. I met him at a party, and I fell for him. I knew I'd got to have him." A travesty. A grotesque travesty, but— "And all my fortunes at thy foot I'll lay, and follow thee, my lord, throughout the world." Although he was married? Trespassers will be prosecuted. It takes more than a printed notice to keep you from reality. If he was unhappy with his wife, and could be happy with me, then why not? We've only one life to live. But it has been said he was happy with his wife. Elsa shook her head. No. They quarrelled like cat and dog. She nagged at him. She was a horrible woman. She got up and lit a cigarette. She said with a little smile, "Probably I'm unfair to her, but I really do think she was rather hateful." Poirot said slowly, "It was a great tragedy." "Yes, it was a great tragedy." She turned on him suddenly. Into the dead, monotonous weariness of her face, something came quiveringly alive. "It killed me. Do you understand? It killed me. Ever since there's been nothing. Nothing at all." Her voice dropped. "Emptiness." She waved her hands impatiently, "like a stuffed fish in a glass case." "Did Amias Creole mean so much to you?" She nodded. It was a queer, confiding little nod, oddly pathetic. She said, "I think I've always had a single-track mind." She mused somberly. "I suppose, really, one ought to put a knife into oneself like Juliet, but to do that is to acknowledge that you're done for, that life's beaten you." "And instead?" "There ought to be everything. Just the same. Once one's got over it. I did get over it. It didn't mean anything to me anymore. I thought I'd go on to the next thing." Yes, the next thing. Poirot saw her plainly, trying so hard to fulfill that crude determination. Saw her beautiful and rich, seductive to men, seeking with greedy, predatory hands to fill up a life that was empty. Hero worship. A marriage to a famous aviator, then an explorer, that big giant of a man, Arnold Stevenson, possibly not unlike Amias Creole physically, a reversion to the creative arts, Ditisham. Elsa Ditisham said, "I've never been a hypocrite. There's a Spanish proverb I've always liked. 'Take what you want and pay for it,' says God. Well, I've done that. I've taken what I wanted, but I've always been willing to pay the price." Hercule Poirot said, "What you do not understand is that there are things that cannot be bought." She stared at him. She said, "I don't mean just money." Poirot said, No, I understand what you mean. But it is not everything in life that has its ticket so much. There are things that are not for sale. Nonsense." He smiled very faintly. In her voice was the arrogance of the successful mill hand who had risen to riches. Hercule Poirot felt a sudden wave of pity. He looked at the ageless, smooth face, the weary eyes, and he remembered the girl whom Amias Creole had painted. Elsa Ditisham said, "Tell me all about this book. What is the purpose of it? Whose idea is it?" "Oh, my dear lady, what other purpose is there but to serve up yesterday's sensation with today's sauce?" "But you're not a writer?" "No, I am an expert on crime." You mean they consult you on crime books? Not always. In this case, I have a commission. From whom? I am, vetting this publication on behalf of an interested party. What party? Miss Carla Le Marchant. Who is she? She is the daughter of Amias and Caroline Crail. Elsa stared for a minute. Then she said, Oh. Oh, of course, there was a child. I remember. I suppose she's grown up now. Yes, she is 21. What's she like? She is tall and dark and, I think, beautiful. And she has courage and personality. Elsa said thoughtfully, I should like to see her. She might not care to see you. Elsa looked surprised. Why? Oh, I see. But what nonsense. She can't possibly remember anything about it. She can't have been more than 6. She knows that her mother was tried for her father's murder. What, and she thinks it's my fault? It is a possible interpretation. Elsa shrugged her shoulders. She said, How stupid. If Caroline had behaved like a reasonable human being... So you take no responsibility? Why should I? I have nothing to be ashamed of. I loved him. I would have made him happy. She looked across at Poirot. Her face broke up. Suddenly, incredibly, he saw the girl of the picture. She said, If I could make you see, if you could see it from my side, if you knew... Poirot leaned forward. But that is what I want. See Mr. Philip Blake, who was there at the time. He is writing me a meticulous account of everything that happened. Mr. Meredith Blake, the same. Now, if you... Elsa Dittisham took a deep breath. She said contemptuously, Those two. Philip was always stupid. Meredith used to trot round after Caroline, but he was quite a dear. But you won't have any real idea from their accounts. He watched her, saw the animation rising in her eyes, saw a living woman take shape from a dead one. She said quickly and almost fiercely, Wouldn't you like the truth? Oh, not for publication, but just for yourself? I will undertake not to publish without your consent. I'd like to write down the truth. She was silent a minute or two, thinking. He saw the smooth hardness of her cheeks falter and take on a younger curve. He saw life ebbing into her as the past claimed her again. To go back, to write it all down, to show you what she was. Her eyes flashed, her breast heaved passionately. She killed him. She killed Amias. Amias who wanted to live, who enjoyed living. Hate oughtn't to be stronger than love, but her hate was. And my hate for her is. I hate her, I hate her, I hate her! She came across to him. She stooped, her hand clutched at his sleeve. She said urgently, You must understand, you must, how we felt about each other. Amias and I mean. There's something... I'll show you. She whirled across the room. She was unlocking a little desk, pulling out a drawer concealed inside a pigeonhole. Then she was back. In her hand was a creased letter. The ink faded. She thrust it on him, and Poirot had a sudden poignant memory of a child he had known who had thrust on him one of her treasures, a special shell picked up on the seashore and zealously guarded. Just so had that little child stood back and watched him. Proud, afraid, keenly critical of his reception of her treasure. He unfolded the faded sheets and read, Elsa, you wonderful child, there never was anything as beautiful, and yet I'm afraid. I'm too old. A middle-aged, ugly-tempered devil with no stability in me. Don't trust me. Don't believe in me. I'm no good apart from my work. The best of me is in that. There, don't say you haven't been warned. Hell, my lovely, I'm going to have you all the same. I'd go to the devil for you, and you know it, and I'll paint a picture of you that will make the fat-headed world hold its sides and gasp. I'm crazy about you. I can't sleep. I can't eat. Elsa, 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 I'm yours forever, yours till death. Amias. 16 years ago. Faded ink, crumbling paper, but the words still alive, still vibrating. He looked across at the woman to whom they had been written. But it was no longer a woman at whom he looked. It was a young girl in love. He thought again of Juliet. This little pig had none. May I ask why, Monsieur Poirot? Hercule Poirot considered his answer to the question. He was aware of a pair of very shrewd grey eyes watching him out of the small, wizened face. He had climbed to the top floor of the bare building and had knocked on the door of number 584 Gillespie Buildings, which had come into existence to provide what were called flatlets for working women. Here, in a small cubic space, existed Miss Cecilia Williams, in a room that was bedroom, sitting room, dining room, and, by judicious use of the gas ring, kitchen. A kind of cubbyhole attached to it contained a quarter-length bath and the usual offices. Meagre though these surroundings might be, Miss Williams had contrived to impress upon them her stamp of personality. The walls were distempered an ascetic pale grey, and various reproductions hung upon them. Dante meeting Beatrice on a bridge, and that picture once described by a child as blind girl sitting on an orange and called, I don't know why, Hope. There were also 2 watercolours of Venice and a sepia copy of Botticelli's Primavera. On the top of the low chest of drawers were a large quantity of faded photographs, mostly, by their style of hairdressing, dating from 20 to 30 years ago. The square of carpet was threadbare, the furniture battered and of poor quality. It was clear to Hercule Poirot that Cecilia Williams lived very near the bone. There was no roast beef here. This was the little pig that had none. Clear, incisive, and insistent, the voice of Miss Williams repeated its demand. You want my recollections of the Crail case. May I ask why? It had been said of Hercule Poirot by some of his friends and associates, at moments when he has maddened them most, that he prefers lies to truth, and will go out of his way to gain his ends by means of elaborate false statements, rather than trust to the simple truth. But in this case, his decision was quickly made. Hercule Poirot did not come of that class of Belgian or French children who have had an English governess, but he reacted as simply and inevitably as various small boys who had been asked in their time, Did you brush your teeth this morning, Harold? Or Richard? Or Anthony? They considered fleetingly the possibility of a lie and instantly rejected it, replying miserably, No, Miss Williams. For Miss Williams had what every successful child educator must have, that mysterious quality, authority. When Miss Williams said, Go up and wash your hands, Joan, or I expect you to read this chapter on the Elizabethan poets and be able to answer my questions on it, she was invariably obeyed. It had never entered Miss Williams' head that she would not be obeyed. So in this case, Hercule Poirot proffered no specious explanation of a book to be written on bygone crimes. Instead, he narrated simply the circumstances in which Carla Le Marchant had sought him out. The small, elderly lady, in the neat, shabby dress, listened attentively. She said, It interests me very much to have news of that child, to know how she has turned out. She is a very charming and attractive young woman with plenty of courage and the mind of her own. Good, said Miss Williams briefly. And she is, I may say, a very persistent person. She is not a person whom it is easy to refuse or put off. The ex-governess nodded thoughtfully. She asked, Is she artistic? I think not, Miss Williams said dryly. Well, that's one thing to be thankful for. The tone of the remark left Miss Williams' views as to artists in no doubt whatever. She added, From your account of her, I should imagine that she takes after her mother, rather than after her father. Very possibly. That you can tell me when you have seen her. Would you like to see her? I should like to see her very much indeed. It is always interesting to see how a child you have known has developed. She was, I suppose, very young when you last saw her. She was 5 1/2, a very charming child, a little over-quiet, perhaps, thoughtful, given to playing her own little games and not inviting outside cooperation, natural and unspoiled. Poirot said, It was fortunate she was so young. Yes, indeed. Had she been older, the shock of the tragedy might have had a very bad effect. Nevertheless, said Poirot, one feels that there was a handicap. However little the child understood or was allowed to know, there would have been an atmosphere of mystery and evasion and an abrupt uprooting. These things are not good for a child. Miss Williams replied thoughtfully, "They may have been less harmful than you think." Poirot said, "Before we leave the subject of Carla la Marchant, a little Carla Creel that was, there is something I would like to ask you. If anyone can explain it, I think you can." "Yes?" Her voice was inquiring, non-committal. Poirot waved his hands in an effort to express his meaning. "There is something, a nuance, I cannot define, but it seems to me always that the child, when I mention her, is not given her full representational value. When I mention her, the response comes always with a vague surprise, as though the person to whom I speak had forgotten altogether that there was a child. Now, surely, mademoiselle, that is not natural. A child, under these circumstances, is a person of importance, not in herself, but as a pivotal point. Amias Creel may have had reasons for abandoning his wife, or for not abandoning her. But in the usual breakup of a marriage, the child forms a very important point. But here, the child seems to count for very little. That seems to me strange." Miss Williams said quickly, "You have put your finger on a vital point, Monsieur Poirot. You are quite right. And that is partly why I said what I did just now, that Carla's transportation to different surroundings might have been in some respects a good thing for her. When she was older, you see, she might have suffered from a certain lack in her home life." She leaned forward and spoke slowly and carefully. "Naturally, in the course of my work, I have seen a good many aspects of the parent and child problem. Many children, most children, I should say, suffer from over-attention on the part of their parents. There is too much love, too much watching over the child. It is uneasily conscious of this brooding and seeks to free itself, to get away and be unobserved. With an only child, that is particularly the case, and of course, mothers are the worst offenders. The result on the marriage is often unfortunate. The husband resents coming second, seeks consolation, or rather flattery and attention, elsewhere, and a divorce results sooner or later. The best thing for a child, I am convinced, is to have what I should term healthy neglect on the part of both its parents. This happens naturally enough in the case of a large family of children and very little money. They are overlooked because the mother has literally no time to occupy herself with them. They realize quite well that she is fond of them, but they are not worried by too many manifestations of the fact. But there is another aspect. One does occasionally find a husband and wife who are so all-sufficient to each other, so wrapped up in each other, that the child of the marriage hardly seems very real to either of them. And in those circumstances, I think a child comes to resent that fact, to feel defrauded and left out in the cold. You understand that I am not speaking of neglect in any way. Mrs. Creel, for instance, was what is termed an excellent mother, always careful of Carla's welfare, of her health, playing with her at the right times and always kind and gay. But for all that, Mrs. Creel was really completely wrapped up in her husband. She existed, one might say, only in him and for him." Miss Williams paused a minute and then said quietly, "That, I think, is the justification for what she eventually did." Hercule Poirot said, "You mean that they were more like lovers than like husband and wife?" Miss Williams, with a slight frown of distaste for foreign phraseology, said, "You could certainly put it that way. He was devoted to her, as she was to him. They were a devoted couple, but he, of course, was a man." Miss Williams contrived to put into that last word a wholly Victorian significance. "Men," said Miss Williams, and stopped. "As a rich property owner says Bolsheviks, as an earnest communist says capitalists, as a good housewife says black beetles, so did Miss Williams say men. From her spinster's, governess's life there rose up a blast of fierce feminism. Nobody hearing her speak could doubt that to Miss Williams men were the enemy." Poirot said, "You hold no brief for men." She answered dryly, "Men have the best of this world. I hope that it will not always be so." Hercule Poirot eyed her speculatively. He could quite easily visualize Miss Williams methodically and efficiently padlocking herself to a railing, and later hunger-striking with resolute endurance. Leaving the general for the particular, he said, "You did not like Amias Crail." "I certainly did not like Mr. Crail, nor did I approve of him. If I were his wife, I should have left him. There are things that no woman should put up with." "But Mrs. Crail did put up with them." "Yes." "You thought she was wrong?" "Yes, I did. A woman should have a certain respect for herself and not submit to humiliation." "Did you ever say anything of that kind to Mrs. Crail?" "Certainly not. It was not my place to do so. I was engaged to educate Angela, not to offer unasked advice to Mrs. Crail. To do so would have been most impertinent."
End of Disc 3.